Memories of the Vietnam War have rushed back with a vengeance thanks to the recent airing of Ken Burns' high-profile series on PBS. Whether you were around at the time or not, it certainly was educational, if not eye-opening. For those who lived or fought during the era, the memories are more painful, the wounds are much deeper. John Pendergrass is a Hattiesburg eye surgeon who has written about his experience as an Air Force flight surgeon during the war. Racing Back to Vietnam also tells the story of his return to Vietnam some 45 years later. John, it's good to see you again.
Thank you.
Yeah, it seems like just yesterday we were down on the coast, and that was an incredible day because there were so many Vietnam veterans like yourself in the room, and you got to be the keynote speaker and telling a little bit about your story. And that was really our first glimpse of Ken Burns' special.
That's true. It was a remarkable event, and it's wonderful for MPB to host it.
Yeah, definitely. Let me just go ahead and ask you, I mean, as a Vietnam veteran, what was your reaction to, because you've watched the series now, what was your reaction to the
I thought that the series was overall a very fair and even portrayal of the war. There are some parts I would have perhaps emphasized a little more, but all in all, I can say is I thought it was very well done. In particular, I liked the way that they concentrated on individual stories, because that's what the war is, an agglomerate of individual stories, and it's very easy to lose that perspective, to turn the war into cold hard statistics instead of the
which Robert McNamara did.
Which he certainly did, yeah. Instead of real live human beings, real brothers, sons, fathers, etc.
I've always heard that you don't fight necessarily for your country or for your flag, but you fight for the person that's on either side of you in the foxhole. That's very true, isn't it?
That's very true. In particular, for me, coming at the end of the war, when I served in the Vietnam War in 1971 and 72, people had pretty well given up on so-called winning the war. The goal was peace with honor. We were trying to get out of Vietnam and give the South Vietnamese a reasonable chance of succeeding as a government.
Yeah, so you were right between 1968, the Tet Offensive, and that was kind of the turning point in American public opinion. And then Nixon came into office, and at that point, were pulling out the ground troops, because you were a flight surgeon, so you were at Da Nang, which was probably one of the busiest airports in the world when you were there.
It was the busiest airport in the world. In 1972, the air war was going full stream. The ground war had pretty well wound down, but the air war was going wide open.
Because I know in the book you said, like in 1968, 1969, there were like 1,000 casualties brought in at a time during a certain amount of time, and then when you were there, it was maybe a dozen.
Very true. Our hospital had an aeromedical evacuation unit where we would take care of casualties that had been stabilized in the field hospitals, and then they would be moved to our aeromedical evacuation unit, and we would take care of them before they were shipped out to places in the Pacific and then sometimes back to the United States.
Well, I guess a good place to start would be back to Delta State. You were a college student in 1962 and something in that area. And Vietnam really wasn't even on the map at that point. You had no idea that that would be such a big part of your life.
That's very true. Vietnam really became known to the public, so to speak, in 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And then when I went to medical school in 1965, it was gradually getting more and more and more intense. More and more people were being called up, and the draft quotas were going up. And by the time I graduated from medical school, there were over 500,000 troops in Vietnam.
Do you remember your draft number?
You know, I didn't, because by the time the draft number came up, I had already gotten my commission or committed to the Air Force, so I was in regardless of...
Right, they already had you.
Yeah, that's true.
They already had you, but you decided to join the Air Force. How come you decided to go that direction?
You know, it's partially a question of convenience. I had decided that I wanted to become an ophthalmologist, and it was difficult to get an ophthalmology residency without your military service commitment already taken care of. So I had my choice. I could have essentially joined any military service, or I could have even gone in the United States Public Health Service. Any of those choices for 2 years would fill your commitment as a physician.
Well, spoiler alert, you did become an ophthalmologist.
Say again?
Yeah, spoiler alert, you did become
Yes,
one.
I did.
Yeah, you did.
That's
So
true.
You've had a great career doing that.
After I was an Air Force flight surgeon, I became an ophthalmologist.
Well, I mean, I love the part of the story where you had a pretty good gig. I mean, everybody who's familiar with Destin, Hubert Air Force Base.
That's true.
That's where you were stationed, and so the nice white sands and
It was a
pretty
wonderful
water.
place to
Yeah.
be. It was, nobody worked on the weekend to speak of. Everybody was laid back and relaxed. We were there for many of the winter months where we had all the restaurants to ourselves. I thought I was set in heaven. And then one day in March, a man called me from the personnel center and said, "Guess what?
Guess
You're
what?"
Going,
Yeah.
You're going to Da Nang, Vietnam."
You were a winner. Yeah. Well, you had you and your wife Polly were married, and you had
Yeah,
your
we've
first
been married
child.
2
yeah.
years, and I had an 8-year-old son. That's the last place on earth that I wanted to go
Yeah,
to.
you weren't real excited about it, and
No, I
then
wasn't
next thing you know,
at all.
you're standing in the middle of the Philippines, right?
That's true.
Yeah,
That's true.
I gotta love this because while everybody else is sitting there dragging their nails to try to get in Vietnam, oh no, not you. You figured out a way to get to Vietnam early. You got to tell us why.
I did.
Yeah.
When I finished my jungle survival school in the Philippines, which was about a week long. Everyone in the Air Force who flies in Vietnam goes to jungle survival school to teach you survival and evasion skills.
Yeah, how did that work out for you? Did you evade capture, or did
Well,
you?
I'm still here, so I
Okay.
guess I did a good job.
It worked.
And I knew that from the day I got in Vietnam, I would come home 1 year later. So I was at the end of May. I was due to get in Da Nang in early June, but I talked to the guy at the base transportation, and they got me over there on May 30th of 1971. And that way I qualified for combat pay for the month of May.
Right.
And I also got an income tax exemption for the month of May. And I also got a rocket attack that night on my very first night in Vietnam. And that was probably one of the very low points of my life. I had that rocket attack. I was probably frightened to death. As I said in my book, I was curled up in my fetal position with a helmet and flak jacket on. And the whole thing just seemed sort of outlandish to me. I thought there would be a freshman orientation or a welcome to the war period before you actually got attacked. But I got attacked on the very first night of my in-country stay.
It wasn't really Russian roulette, but it was Viet Cong roulette because
It was.
you didn't know. So here you were trying to escape the IRS, and you ran right into a rocket attack.
I did. So
What does a flight surgeon do?
a flight surgeon's primary medical duties, or primary duties, I should say, are medical. And he's basically a family practitioner in the Air Force setting, but he's also, his main responsibility is the care and safety of aircrew members.
Right.
I went to what we call flight surgeon school for a couple of months when I first got in the Air Force, and we learned about flying and flight medicine and public health, things like that. But we never actually flew.
Right.
We never got in an airplane in our whole flight surgeon training. But flight surgeons wear wings. They're rated officers, so they're required to have a certain amount of flight time. The idea being that if you fly yourself some, you will be more aware of the
stresses
problems
and
that the aircrew members were. So my first tour at Hurlburt in Florida, I was assigned to an A-37 squadron, which is a small attack aircraft.
Made by Cessna, who usually makes small little airplanes. Yeah.
Right, and it was also used as a trainer in another form, T-37. So it was a wonderful airplane to learn about flying. The pilot and the passenger sit side by side with dual controls, and the pilot would show me this, and I'd try it, and he'd do it. And it's sort of sort of like the same way you would take your 13-year-old son out in the country and show him how to drive a car. That's how my flying was. The big guys were showing me how to fly an airplane.
But not every flight surgeon really got the kind of training and hours that you got. You'd managed to make relationships and to find people that could get you up in the air, didn't you?
I did. The requirement for flying with a flight surgeon can be met relatively simple. A lot of the guys would simply ride in a transport plane from one place to another and put their name on the manifest and get the required flying time. But I was lucky to get with an A-37 squadron, and then when I went to Vietnam, I actually chose an F-4 Phantom squadron.
Which is the top line fighter of the time.
At the time, as I always tell people, flying a Phantom in the Vietnam War in combat was what we call the big show. Yeah. It was something it's the reason you have an Air Force. A fighter squadron in combat is the reason the Air Force exists. And I was very happy to be able to come along in a small way,
How did you approach it, saying, "Hey, can I hop along for a ride here"?
I sort of, first of all, there was a war going on, so everybody was busy. Right. And I just went and I told the guys, they knew the flight surgeons ready to fly, but the other F-4 squadrons did not have a flight surgeon, so nobody really knew. And I would sort of pester them, and I talked to the squadron commander, and they put me through a training process. I studied this, that, and the other. I went out to the flight line. I sat in on the briefings and so on and so forth. And then they gave me a couple of training flights, and then they sent me out in the back seat over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. I mean, it was relatively quick.
Yeah, they put you right in the middle of the big show.
They did, yeah.
You were telling me something a little bit right before we started, that the Ho Chi Minh Trail was some of the most bombed territory on the earth of all time.
It was. It's located in the panhandle of the country of Laos. And during the war, over 2 million tons of bombs were dropped on the country of Laos, principally by the United States Air Force. And it made it the most bombed country per capita in the history of the world. I mean, it was pounded mercilessly. And later on, as I talk about in my book, I actually went back to the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Oh, did you really?
And I tried to find people who'd lived there. I couldn't find anybody who'd lived there. I think essentially what happened to people, it was such an intensive battlefield, they left by and large.
I remember during the Ken Burns special, they talked to some people that had been actually bombed. Yeah. And I can't even imagine that they survived.
Yeah. I think a lot of them lived in caves. That's one revelation I had never thought about it. There are a lot of caves in Laos and in Vietnam. That limestone soil lends itself to caves and tunnels and so on.
In case any of our viewers missed the Ken Burns special, why was the Ho Chi Minh Trail that important to North Vietnam?
North Vietnam directed and supplied the Viet Cong and their own troops in South Vietnam. So they had to supply them, and they couldn't come from North Vietnam directly to South Vietnam easily. They would go through the demilitarized zone, which was somewhat defended by South Vietnamese and American troops. So they would exit North Vietnam on the western border into Laos, and then travel down the Laotian Panhandle and exit back into South Vietnam, on the eastern coast. But the Ho Chi Minh Trail was a trail they've estimated over 12,000 miles. There were dozens and dozens of trails and offshoots and so on and so forth.
How many flights did you end up getting in?
I flew 54 combat missions.
Which actually wasn't as many as a normal pilot,
no,
right?
And whenever I talk about my book, I'm always careful to point that out. The average pilot or backseater when I was there flew roughly 3 times as many. And I also point out I flew most of mine in Laos, which is a higher threat area than South Vietnam, mainly because of anti-aircraft fire, but it was nowhere near as dangerous as North Vietnam. And at the time I was there, for the most part, we were not flying in North Vietnam.
Yeah, that really took place almost about the time you left.
It did.
Yeah.
I left 1 week after I left. Operation Linebacker started, and the guys that I'd been living with, they were going up to North Vietnam. Some cases going what we call going downtown to Hanoi. You know, and like I say, that's another entirely different ball game. That was. Very dangerous.
Briefly describe a common mission, just one that you can remember when you had anti-aircraft fire and what it felt like for you.
You know, most of our missions when I was there were what we called interdiction missions, which were an attempt to reduce the men and material coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail to the South Vietnam. We would typically start a couple hours before we'd go to our wing briefing room, and we'd find out our actual target. And we'd have a target folder with frequencies, maps, pictures, and everything, and we'd learn about our target. Then we'd get an intelligence briefing that would tell us how things were going in the war, what was happening at our target, and so on and so forth. We'd get a weather briefing. That would tell us what the weather is, which was very important because the weather, as the weather went, so went the mission in a lot of cases. Then we'd go back in our flight, the two airplanes, the two front seaters and the two back seaters would brief our tactics. Then we would go to life support and get our life support, our survival vest, our G-suit, pick up a .38 revolver. We'd go to the flight line, pre-flight the airplane, get cleared, take off. We'd be vectored by the local radar to the Airborne Command and Control Center, which was an orbiting C-130 that would sort of direct you to a forward air controller. A forward air controller, or FAC, was a small aircraft that would actually find the targets for you. Then we would link up with the FAC. He would mark the targets with a smoke rocket, a white phosphorus, what we called Willie Pete. And then we'd make a series of diving passes trying to strike those. Then we'd get a report card, so to speak, a bomb damage assessment, and head back, and that was it.
And do it all the next day.
Yeah.
You talk about Ron Bond.
Yeah.
Ron Bond was somebody that you knew
Ron Bond was a friend of mine who lived just a couple doors down from me at our squadron hooch. He was the first person lost from our squadron from the time that I arrived in Vietnam. Yeah. When I was in Vietnam, our squadron had 20 F-4s. And we had probably 20 to 25 pilots and 20 to 25 backseaters. Yeah. During my year, we lost 4 aircraft. 2 of the crews were picked up and rescued, and 2 were lost in action. But Ron was the very first one lost in action. And he was one of these stories that's unfortunately too common. He was out in his plane by himself. They weren't on what was called a fast fact mission, and he didn't check back in, and nobody knew where he was, and they hadn't found his remains to this day. Wow. You know, when I told Ron's story, I looked back at the letters that I'd written home about it to my wife, and I looked up a good bit on the internet also. But I really wanted more detail to the story, so I was able to locate Ron's sister, Dory, who lives in Texas, and she told me his story, and she told the very heart-wrenching story of the day she was 17, on her 17th birthday. She and her mother came home from Dory getting her first driver's license, and there, waiting at the door, were 2 men in uniform, that sight that military families dread, you know.
Yeah, and it's probably just as raw and powerful today to her.
It really is. It really is. It's just, and stories like that are really what make up the war, and that's what I was mentioning earlier. There's so many of those.
That's one of the things I liked about the book. There are so many little rich details about everything from the kind of currency to everything else that the soldiers had. Mm-hmm. One of the things, when your time came up, though, you really put the war behind you pretty quickly, didn't you?
I was lucky there, and I think I came home, when I left Vietnam, I came home and I was immediately separated from the Air Force. And within a month, I had started an ophthalmology residency.
And you were busy.
I didn't have time.
That's right.
And you know, Marshall, I think a lot of other people are that. I think some way the unflattering stereotype of the Vietnam veteran who's still distraught from the war is not completely true. Yeah. The war affected everybody who served in it, but I think most people did not define them. And most people, you know, generally speaking, Vietnam veterans have done well in life compared to their peers. Yeah. Now, of course, that doesn't take away from the terrible death and injuries, both physical and mental, that affected many people. But speaking, you know, there were 2.5 million people who served in the war, and most people were able to get past it pretty well.
You went on to have a great career, a great family. One thing, I think you're a hero of mine because in your 60s you decided to do an Ironman triathlon on 6 continents. I would figure you would have done the 7th, but the water in Antarctica would be a little cold. What possessed you to do that? I mean, that's incredible.
It was just like flying F-4 Phantoms. It sort of happened by accident. There really was no...
Well, the first one was an accident, but you meant to do the next 5,
yeah,
I'm sure.
That's true, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I thought I wanted to try it. I'd been a runner most of my life. My running had gotten slower, and I'd been doing shorter triathlons. And at that time, an Ironman triathlon was very difficult to get a slot in. At the time I did my first one, there were only 20 Ironman triathlons in the whole world, and now there are probably 150 or so. So it was special because it was hard to get a slot in, and that's the reason I did my first one. I went to Brazil because I couldn't get a slot in one of the Ironman races in the United States. And then, you know, it became a convenient, enjoyable habit to sort of work a vacation in with that, because you feel wonderful when you complete one. You feel relieved.
Yeah, you get a marathon in, a 100-mile bike ride, and what is it, 2-mile swim?
2.4 swim,
Yeah, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, so you're usually very happy to have done it, proud of having done it, and you can have a very enjoyable vacation.
Well, and the reason I bring all this up is not only because, I mean, it's an incredible feat, but it was also the vehicle that got you back to Vietnam.
It was. You know, about 4 years ago, I sort of became reinterested in the war. I started reading some of the letters that I'd written to my wife and also to my mother. They both had the good sense to save them, and I have something like 150 letters. And I'm very happy I have them. I could not have written this book without them. You just don't remember things 45 years ago correctly. So I started looking at those letters, and I started going back to my fighter wing reunion and talking with the guys. And I pulled out my flight records, and I looked, you know, where I went, so on and so forth, and started reading a lot about the war. So I was ready to go back to Vietnam. And then one day I saw an announcement about the Ironman Vietnam. So that gave me the reason to go back, and I actually went back and did part of that race. My Ironman story is not one to jump up and shout about. It's a very modest accomplishment. But I went back and did the race, and then I spent a total of about a month traveling in Vietnam, both, you know, what we call South Vietnam and North Vietnam. Of course, it's all Vietnam now, but Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, and many other places. Now, part of my trip I did with a group of Marines, which was very enlightening to me, just my respect for the...
Because you were flying over them the whole time.
That's right.
Yeah.
You know, the Marine and the Army grunts were down in the jungle, and I was sitting at night in an air-conditioned barracks with clean sheets and cold beer, so I really have nothing to complain about.
You flew into the same airport that you took off from 45 years earlier.
You know, within a couple of weeks, it was almost to the date.
Yeah.
Almost 45 years from when on that very same one, and I looked at the twin runways, and I remembered so much. And the only thing really that survived are these sort of half-moon-shaped concrete and steel revetments that the aircraft were parked in to protect them from rocket attacks. They're still there. They're everywhere in Vietnam. They'll probably be there in the second coming, you know, there. But everything else is new. The airport terminal is where the old base operations is, and to my great amusement, it has a Burger King. You know,
Oh, wow.
It's just the country has adopted so many of the Western, the free market capitalism. You know.
Well, as we get toward the end of the interview, and I hate that it's getting toward the end of the interview, kind of, I guess, describe your thoughts on when you went back and what you think of the country today, and is it where you thought it would be back in 1971?
Well, you know, I was extremely skeptical that they would be welcoming of Americans. You know, I had heard that, but I was very, very skeptical. But I talked to a lot of people. You know, before I went, I'd signed my contract to write my book, so I knew I had to. And I talked to a lot of people. I think the guides I was with got annoyed that so many people I was talking to. But my conclusion is they really do welcome and like Americans. Part of the reason is, I think, their Buddhist heritage of tolerance and forgiveness. Mm-hmm. Part of the reason is they won the war. It's easy to be magnet. But probably the biggest reason is it's in their interest and our interest to have a good relationship.
Right.
We're the counterbalance to the China in the north. You know, the China's been
historically for
exactly the great enemy up north. The Vietnam's been trapped on the edge of the Chinese empire for their entire existence, and it's in their interest and our interest to have a good relationship.
Well, John, congratulations on the book, and thank you for writing it, because, I mean, with Ken Burns' special and with your book, I feel like I understand the war just a little bit better.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, and I mean, when you go out and you're going to be doing the book signings and everything else, you'll probably get to talk to a lot of veterans like we did down in Ocean Springs.
You know, I do, and I love that. I enjoy hearing veteran stories. I never get tired of it. Every one of them's and I learn something from them. So if you have a story and you're a veteran, or there's a veteran in your family, please tell me.